Family drama is already terrifying enough, but what if your relatives were hiding something way worse than bad genetics and awkward Thanksgiving dinners? Annie thought she was just dealing with grief, but little did she know, her entire bloodline was cursed in the most horrifying way possible. When tragic deaths start piling up and eerie secrets unravel, she'll realize that some family legacies are better left buried. For this family, things are about to go straight to hell, and they don't even see it coming. On the morning of their grandmother's funeral, Steve rolls out of bed and wakes up his son Peter, telling him to get ready. But there's one problem. Charlie is nowhere to be found. Turns out, she spent the entire night passed out in the treehouse like some kind of forest goblin. Steve hauls her inside, while their mom, Annie, waits in the car, probably already dreading the whole day. At the funeral home, Annie gives a eulogy that's more awkward than heartfelt. She describes her mother as loving but distant. Translation: they weren't exactly braiding each other's hair and swapping secrets. And judging by the number of unfamiliar faces in the crowd, it's clear this woman had a whole other life Annie knew nothing about. After the service, the family returns home and tries to slip back into their normal routine. Well, everyone except Charlie. She's the only one actually grieving. But instead of leaning on her mum, she barely acknowledges her. When Annie checks on her, she reminds Charlie that she was always Grandma's favorite. In fact, the old woman was so obsessed with her that she insisted on feeding her as a baby. Yep, weird. Charlie, clearly disturbed, asks who's going to take care of her now. Annie chuckles and tells her, "Well, me, obviously," but Charlie doesn't look convinced. Annie tries to comfort her, telling her to let it all out and cry, but the girl just stares blankly. Then, as Annie turns to leave, she notices something strange scratched into the wall above Charlie's head. The word, Satoni. She doesn't ask about it, doesn't freak out, just gives Charlie a few more kisses and walks out. Huge mistake. Back in her studio, Annie sifts through a box of her mother's belongings and comes across an old book titled Notes on Spiritualism. Inside, she finds a handwritten note from her mother, an eerie message asking for forgiveness, promising that in the end, the rewards will be worth the sacrifice. Yeah, that's not unsettling at all. Annie quickly shoves the book back into the box, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. As she turns off the lights and heads for the door, something makes her stop. Glancing back, she freezes. A ghostly figure of her mother is standing in the shadows, watching her. For a moment, Annie just stares, too stunned to react, before flicking the light back on. But in an instant, the figure is gone, as if it was never there. She debates telling her husband, Steve, about what just happened, but for some reason, she keeps it to herself and goes to bed like nothing ever happened. Big mistake. The next morning at school, Charlie is supposed to be finishing a quiz, but instead, she's busy building one of her creepy little toys. Just as she's lost in her project, a loud thud snaps everyone's attention to the window. A pigeon has just crashed into the glass, snapping its neck on impact. The other kids react with shock, but Charlie barely blinks. Later that afternoon, as everyone heads home, she spots the bird's lifeless body lying in a bush. Without hesitation, she pulls out a pair of scissors, ones she swiped from the teacher's desk earlier, and with a quick snip, she slices off its head and casually stuffs it into her pocket like it's a souvenir. As she straightens up, wiping the blood from her fingers, she suddenly feels eyes on her. Looking up, she sees a strange older woman across the street, staring directly at her. And to make things even creepier, the woman is smiling and waving like she knows something Charlie doesn't. While working on her miniature models, Annie starts diving into research about spirits and how to communicate with the dead. She's fully absorbed in her reading when she hears Steve coming home. Getting up to greet him, she passes by her mother's old bedroom, only to stop in her tracks. The door, which should have been shut, is now wide open. A chill creeps down her spine as she steps inside. On the floor, she notices something strange. A black triangle carved into the wooden floorboards. It wasn't there before. Uneasy, she asks Steve if he left the door open, but he insists he hasn't been in there. Neither of them has. Not taking any chances, they decide to lock up the room for good. Before they can dwell on it further, Peter interrupts with a phone call for his father. It's from the cemetery. a worker informs Steve that his mother-in-law's gravesite was desecrated overnight. Steve is clearly rattled, but when Annie asks what's wrong, he lies, telling her it's just a minor billing issue. She doesn't question it and casually mentions that she's going out to see a movie. In reality, Annie isn't heading to a theater. Instead, she finds herself at a local community center, where a support group is holding a meeting for people dealing with grief. As the discussion opens up to new arrivals, she hesitates for a moment before raising her hand. At first, she tries to keep it simple, but before she knows it, everything she's been holding in starts spilling out. She confesses that her family has always been haunted, not by ghosts, but by mental illness. Her mother, her father, and even her brother, who took his own life after becoming convinced that their mother was trying to put people inside of him. Annie's voice wavers as she admits that, because of this, her mother was never allowed near Peter when he was growing up, but by the time Charlie was born, things had changed. The grandmother moved in with them, growing uncomfortably close to her granddaughter in ways that Annie could never quite understand. Meanwhile, Peter is hanging out in his room when his phone buzzes. A text from a friend inviting him to a huge party the next night. He thinks nothing of it, completely unaware that outside in the darkness, someone is lurking in the treehouse, silently watching his every move. The next day, Charlie is busy assembling one of her homemade toys when something catches her eye. A strange flash of light flickering across her bedroom walls before vanishing out the window. Mesmerized, she follows it outside, her bare feet pressing into the damp ground as she traces a set of adult-sized footprints leading from the treehouse into the dense woods. Back inside, Peter knocks on the door to his mother's studio, asking if he can borrow the car to attend a school event. Annie barely glances up from her work, distracted and distant, before giving a condition. If he's going, he has to take Charlie with him. Peter groans, but agrees. However, when he goes to fetch his sister, she's nowhere to be found. Deep in the woods, Charlie follows the mysterious trail until she reaches a clearing. There, she freezes. Sitting in front of a flickering ritual fire is a figure that looks exactly like her grandmother. Before she can process what she's seeing, Annie suddenly appears, yanking her back toward the house, completely unaware of the eerie presence in the trees. Despite Charlie's protests, Annie insists she tag along with her brother. The girl doesn't want to go, but she has no choice. As they drive toward the party, the car speeds past an old electrical pole, etched with a strange occult symbol, one that neither of them notices. The moment they arrive, Peter immediately ditches Charlie to go upstairs and impress a girl from his class, leaving his little sister completely unsupervised. That's when everything goes horribly wrong. Wandering through the party alone, Charlie grabs a slice of cake, completely unaware that it contains nuts. Within minutes, her throat begins to swell, and panic sets in. Struggling to breathe, she stumbles through the crowd until she finally finds Peter, gasping out that something is wrong. His heart drops. Realizing she's having a severe allergic reaction, he scoops her up and sprints for the car, desperate to get her to the hospital before it's too late. Speeding down the pitch-black road, Peter grips the wheel with white-knuckled hands, his mind racing as he glances at Charlie, struggling to breathe in the back seat. Desperate for air, she leans out of the window, gasping. Then, out of nowhere, a dead deer appears in the middle of the road. Peter's reflexes kick in and he yanks the wheel hard to the side. But in his panic, he veers too close to an electrical pole. In an instant, there's a sickening thud. Silence. Peter's breath catches in his throat. His hands tremble on the wheel. He knows what just happened, but he can't bring himself to turn around. His chest rises and falls in short, shallow breaths as he stares straight ahead, frozen. Finally, he exhales, slowly lifting his foot off the brake. The car rolls forward, away from the scene. When he pulls into the driveway, he doesn't even look back. He just gets out, walks inside, and climbs into bed. He doesn't move. He just waits for morning to come. And when it does, a piercing scream shatters the silence. The girl's severed head lies discarded in the dirt, ants already swarming over it. Annie collapses in agony, her screams echoing through the house. The loss shatters her completely, driving a wedge even deeper between her and Peter. They barely speak. After the funeral, Steve goes to check on his wife, but when he enters their bedroom, she's nowhere in sight. Instead, he notices something new. Carved into the wall above their bed, in jagged, deliberate strokes, is a single word: Zazas. That night, Annie retreats to the treehouse. The red glow of the space heaters flickers against the walls as she curls up inside, trying to feel closer to her daughter. The next day, while sitting in class, Peter catches a glimpse of something horrifying in the car's rearview mirror: Charlie's headless body, exactly as he left it. The shock sends a jolt of panic through him, but before he can react, the vision is gone. Later, under the bleachers with his friends, the weight of everything crashes down on him. His breathing grows shallow, his chest tightens, and before he knows it, he's in full-blown panic mode, breaking down in front of everyone. Overwhelmed, he stays out late, avoiding home, avoiding his mother. When he finally steps through the door, Annie doesn't say a word. She simply grabs her keys and walks out, heading straight for a grief support meeting. But once she reaches the parking lot, she hesitates, unable to bring herself to go inside. That's when Joan appears. Stepping in front of Annie's car, the older woman introduces herself, acting warm and familiar. She shares that she recently lost both her son and grandson, and offers Annie her phone number, insisting that she reach out if she ever needs to talk. Back at home, Steve is waiting up for Annie, hoping to comfort her. But even his presence feels suffocating, and instead of engaging, she silently slips away to spend another night in the treehouse. Meanwhile, Peter lays in bed, staring at the dim red glow coming from outside. The house is eerily quiet until he hears it, a faint clicking sound, Charlie's sound. His breath catches in his throat as he slowly sits up. In the shadows of his room, something shifts. His eyes adjust, and in the corner, he swears he sees it. Her headless body. Frozen in terror, he blinks. It's just a pile of clothes. Morning comes, and Annie busies herself in her studio, trying to drown out her thoughts. But when a jar of blue paint suddenly topples over on its own, spilling across her work, she notices something odd. The paint has landed directly on Joan's phone number. Taking it as a sign, she decides to reach out. Driving across town, Annie arrives at Joan's apartment and immediately notices something unsettling. The welcome mat at her door looks exactly like the ones her mother used to make. Ignoring the eerie coincidence, she steps inside. As they talk, Annie finally lets her guard down, confessing the unbearable pain of finding Charlie's body. The emotions hit her so hard that she fumbles for the medication in her purse, swallowing a pill with a sip of tea. But as she wipes her lips, she notices something strange. A residue. Something thick. Something off. Joan quickly shifts the conversation, asking about Peter. That's when Annie finally opens up about the real reason their relationship is strained. She struggles with sleepwalking, something that used to be harmless. But one night, years ago, when Peter and Charlie still shared a bed, she woke up standing over them, drenched in paint thinner, a lit match in her hand. Peter saw everything. From that moment on, he never looked at her the same way. No matter how much she's tried to explain or make things right, the damage was already done. That night, as the family sits down for dinner, the air is thick with tension. No one speaks. No one even makes eye contact. Finally, Peter thanks his dad for making dinner, and Annie lets out a quiet, bitter laugh. Peter catches it immediately. He asks if she has something to say, and just like that, the dam breaks. Slamming her hands on the table, Annie explodes. She's spent years trying to be a good mother, trying to make Peter love her, but he never has. And now, Charlie is dead because of him. And the worst part? He won't even admit it. He won't apologize. He won't take responsibility. The room falls into stunned silence. Then Peter fires back. Charlie wouldn't have been at that party in the first place if Annie hadn't made her go. That's the last straw. Annie storms out, and Steve reaches over to comfort Peter. But it's clear he's barely holding himself together either. Later, as Annie is leaving an art supply store, she spots Joan in the parking lot. The woman looks excited, practically glowing as she waves her over. She pulls Annie aside, bursting with some unbelievable news. She's met a medium who taught her how to contact her dead grandson, Louis. Annie is skeptical, but Joan insists it's real. She felt him, she heard him, and she can prove it. Back at Joan's apartment, the lights are low, and a single candle flickers between them. Joan sets her hands on an upside-down glass and invites Annie to do the same. Then she calls out to Louis, asking him to show that he's there. The glass suddenly shifts. Annie yanks her hands away, staring in disbelief as it moves on its own. Heart pounding, she ducks under the table, searching for a trick, wires, magnets, anything. But there's nothing. This is real. As Joan continues questioning the spirit, the glass moves in response, spelling out messages Annie can't explain. Then, out of nowhere, a gust of wind brushes past her, making her hair shift ever so slightly. Before she can process what's happening, Joan pulls out a small chalkboard and sets it on the table. Moments later, the chalk begins writing on its own. That's enough for Annie. Overwhelmed and terrified, she begs Joan to stop. But Joan remains calm. She reassures Annie that it's completely harmless, nothing to be afraid of. In fact, she wants Annie to try it herself. She explains the process step by step. First, Annie will need to light a special candle. Then, she must choose an object that reminds her of Charlie and place it nearby. Finally, she'll read a short passage from a slip of paper Joan hands her. It's written in a language Joan doesn't understand, but she insists it's essential. The medium who taught her said so. And there's one last condition. Annie's entire family must be inside the house when she does it. With her mind racing, Annie takes the items and rushes out of the apartment. That night, she tosses and turns in bed, unable to sleep. Then, something catches her eye. A line of ants crawling across the floor. She follows their winding path out of her room and down the hall, finally stopping at Peter's bedroom door. Peering inside, she sees him lying completely still in bed. His mouth hangs open. Ants are pouring out of it. Horrified, she steps closer. But before she can react, Peter suddenly sits up, his expression eerily calm. "What are you doing here?" he asks. Almost involuntarily, the words spill from Annie's mouth. She never wanted to be his mother. She tried everything to stop it, to stop him from being born. But she wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to save him. Suddenly, flames engulf the entire room. Annie gasps, then jolts awake, back in her bed. Heart pounding, she sits up, trying to catch her breath. It was just a dream, wasn't it? Shaken but determined, she gets out of bed and heads straight to the bathroom. Locking the door behind her, she takes a deep breath and begins the ritual, carefully reciting the words Joan gave her. Once everything is set, she rushes to wake Peter and Steve. Her voice is frantic, almost desperate as she apologizes for her recent behavior, insisting she needs to show them something, right now. It's just before 2 a.m., but she doesn't care. Downstairs, she leads them into the dining room, urging them to take a seat. The men exchange wary glances, clearly uneasy, but after some coaxing, they agree to humor her. Annie clasps their hands tightly. She calls out for Charlie's spirit. The air in the room shifts. Peter flinches. He feels something. The space around them seems to ripple. Then, right before their eyes, the glass on the table moves on its own. Their shock only deepens when Annie grabs Charlie's notebook and asks her to draw something. That's when things take a dark turn. A cabinet across the room explodes, sending shards of glass flying. The candle in front of them flares up, flames bursting wildly before suddenly extinguishing, only to reignite moments later, completely on its own. Before anyone can react, Annie's body goes rigid. Then, a deep, unnatural growl escapes her lips. Her posture stiffens, her eyes go blank, and when she speaks, it's not her voice. It's Charlie's. Peter recoils in terror, his voice shaking as he begs her to stop. Steve doesn't hesitate. He grabs a glass of water and throws it in her face. The trance breaks instantly. Annie gasps, looking around in confusion. She has no idea what just happened, but all three of them can feel it. Something dark just forced its way in, and whether they realize it or not, it's already too late. That night, Annie is jolted awake by a strange noise echoing through the house. Heart pounding, she follows the sound to Charlie's room. Inside, everything is still, except for Charlie's notebook, lying open on the bed. The pages turn on their own, a pencil scratching across them, sketching eerie drawings without anyone holding it. Meanwhile, Peter tosses and turns in his sleep, uneasy. Then, a faint noise stirs him. His eyes flutter open, adjusting to the darkness. His breath catches in his throat. Charlie is standing in the corner of his room. Before he can react, her head suddenly drops from her shoulders, tumbling forward, only to transform into a toy ball when it hits the floor. The family dog growls at the doorway, its hackles raised. Something unseen lurks there. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of hands shoot out from behind Peter's bed. They clamp around his throat, yanking him down into the mattress. The bedroom door slams shut. Peter thrashes, struggling to break free as his vision blurs. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure disappears. He shoots upright, gasping for air. Annie is standing in the room. Terrified, Peter backs away, his voice trembling as he accuses her of trying to kill him, just like before. Annie grabs his shoulders, shaking her head. She promises she's going to fix this. She has to before things spiral even further out of control. Determined to end it, she grabs Charlie's notebook and rushes to the fireplace. Without hesitation, she throws it into the flames. Instantly, her own sleeve ignites. She screams, frantically slapping at the fire, but it won't go out. It sears through the fabric, burning straight into her skin. Only when she yanks the notebook from the flames does the fire on her arm vanish. The next morning, she storms over to Joan's apartment, desperate for answers. She knocks, no response. Peering through the window, she sees the curtains drawn, but something inside catches her eye. An altar, surrounded by flickering candles. It's littered with the severed heads of small animal. And at its center is a photo of Peter, placed inside a carved-out triangle. Annie's stomach turns. Then she glances down at the welcome mat, and recognition strikes her like a bolt of lightning. It looks exactly like the ones her mother used to make. A terrible realization dawns. She finally has a new lead, but she's not going to like where it takes her. Meanwhile, Peter sits outside the school, eating lunch and lost in thought, until something across the street catches his eye. Joan. She's standing there staring straight at him. Then, to his horror, she starts shouting at him. Her voice cuts through the air, speaking words in a strange foreign tongue. It's almost like a spell, commanding him to leave his body. Peter's stomach churns. He can't look away. Later, as he sits in class, something terrible happens. Without warning, his arm shoots into the air, stiff and unnatural, like an invisible force is yanking it upward. His fingers bend at impossible angles. His face contorts into a twisted grimace, his eyes wide with terror. The entire class turns to stare, frozen in shock. Then, in an instant, Peter's head slams down onto his desk. Crack! A muffled gasp ripples through the room. Blood trickles from his nose. Before anyone can react, his head slams down again, harder. The impact echoes through the room. His nose snaps. And then, just like that, he breaks free. Peter collapses onto the floor, screaming at the top of his lungs. Back at the house, Annie frantically sifts through her mother's old belongings, desperate for answers. That's when she finds them. The welcome mats, each one carefully stitched by her mother. One for her, one for her brother, Charles. Her breath catches in her throat. The mat for Charles is stitched with the same occult symbol she's seen before. Her hands shake as she rummages deeper into the box, pulling out an old book. The same symbol is stamped onto its cover. Flipping through, she finds pages filled with an unreadable language. Then, buried beneath them, she discovers another book, this one titled Invocations. She hesitates, then flips to the marked page. And that's when she makes a horrifying realization. The text describes a powerful entity, King Paimon, a god of mischief, a demon. It states that when summoned, Paimon first possesses the most vulnerable host before moving on to his ultimate goal, inhabiting the body of a human male. And those who serve him? They're rewarded with unimaginable wealth. Annie's hands tremble as she flips through an old photo album. Her heart pounds as she recognizes Joan. There she is, standing beside Annie's mother, both of them wearing necklaces adorned with the cult's symbol. Then, the final, stomach-churning revelation. A photo of her mother, surrounded by people. The cult. They're showering her with gold coins. And Annie finally sees the truth. Her mother was their leader all along. Acting on a gut feeling, Annie rushes to the hallway and yanks open the attic door. The second she does, a swarm of flies buzzes around her, the air thick with the stench of decay. Swallowing her fear, she climbs up. Her flashlight flickers across the attic, scanning the dust-covered floor until it lands on something in the corner. Annie's breath catches in her throat. It's a corpse, or what's left of one. Her mother's decapitated body lies crumpled in the shadows, dressed in an old ceremonial gown embroidered with the cult symbol. A candle, still burning, is placed between her legs. Above her, smeared onto the attic wall in dried blood, is the same occult symbol. Annie stumbles back, bile rising in her throat. Meanwhile, Steve picks Peter up from school, still shaken from the boys' breakdown earlier. But the moment they pull into the driveway, Annie bursts out of the house, frantically waving them down. She's rambling, talking about evidence, about proof. Peter, barely conscious, is helped inside and put to bed. Then, Annie grabs Steve's arm and drags him toward the attic, insisting she has to show him something. He doesn't believe a word of it, but as soon as he pulls open the attic door, the putrid wave of dead flesh hits him, along with the flies. His frustration vanishes, replaced by sheer, undeniable terror. While he stares in shock, Annie rushes back downstairs, desperate to fix things. She starts a fire in the fireplace, then grabs the photo album. When Steve finally stumbles back down, his face is pale. But instead of saying anything, he just stares at her. Something unreadable in his eyes. That's when it hits her. He thinks she did this. He thinks she dug up her mother's body, that she's the one losing her mind. Annie shakes her head furiously, begging him to believe her. She tells him the truth. She accidentally let something into their house, something evil. And now, the only way to stop it is to burn Charlie's notebook. But there's a catch. If the book burns, so will she. Her hands tremble as she holds it over the flames, but she can't do it. Instead, she begs Steve to do it for her. Steve takes the book, looks at her, then slowly steps toward the fire. For a moment, it seems like he's going to do it. Then he stops, turns back to her, and in the coldest, most exhausted voice, he says, "I'm done." He tells her he's not feeding into her delusions anymore, that she needs help. Annie's breath quickens. Then, in a flash of desperation, she lunges forward, snatching the book from his hands, and throws it into the fire. For a split second, nothing happens. Then, without warning, Steve erupts into flames. The fire consumes him instantly. Annie screams, but there's nothing she can do. She watches, frozen in horror, as her husband is burned alive right in front of her eyes. Then, suddenly, a strange beam of light flickers across her face. Her pupils widen, her body stiffens, and just like that, she's gone. The demon has taken her. That makes 2 family members down, and 2 more to go. As night falls, the house becomes an unholy sanctuary, encircled by an eerie congregation of naked cultists standing motionless in the shadows. Their silent presence signals that the ritual is reaching its climax. Upstairs, Peter stirs awake, disoriented. A strange glow filters through his window, emanating from the treehouse. But unlike before, it burns, a pulsating, flickering light, as if something is waiting for him inside. Confused, he calls out, "Mom?" Unbeknownst to him, Annie is already there. She clings to the ceiling like an insect. She watches him with an unnatural stillness, waiting. As Peter sits up, his skin prickles with unease. The air feels wrong. Then, with a silent, inhuman crawl, Annie slithers through the darkness, slipping out of the room unnoticed. Peter gets out of bed and steps into the hallway, drawn toward the sounds of something moving downstairs. A series of muffled crashes echo through the house, each one sending a jolt of terror through his body. He takes a tentative step forward. A shadow moves behind him, not his own. As he passes through the living room, his breath catches. His father's charred, headless corpse lies sprawled before the fireplace. The sight is grotesque, the scent of burnt flesh lingering in the air. Something skitters above him. Annie is watching from the ceiling, her gaunt frame shrouded in darkness. Then, a door creaks behind him. Peter turns. A figure stands in the shadows. An unfamiliar man, grinning. Before he can react, a demonic roar erupts from the corner. Annie lunges at him, her face twisted in a grotesque snarl. Peter bolts. His mother gives chase, her movements erratic and unnatural. He scrambles up the attic ladder, pulling it up just in time as she hurls herself at the door. But she doesn't stop. Hanging upside down like a deranged puppet, Annie slams her head against the attic door, again and again and again, with relentless mechanical force. Inside, Peter stumbles backward. The attic reeks of death. The space where his grandmother's body had been lying is now empty. In its place, pinned to the wall, is a photograph of him. His eyes have been gouged out. He hyperventilates. "This isn't real. This isn't real." A new sound makes his stomach drop. A sickening, wet, slicing noise. Slowly, Peter looks up. Annie floats in midair, her body rigid, her arms working feverishly. In her hands, a thin metal wire is pressed against her own throat, and she's soaring through it. Her face remains expressionless, but the wire moves faster, and faster, and faster. Blood pours down her body, thick and dark, drenching her nightgown as she severs her own neck with impossible speed. Peter screams. That's when he sees them. 3 more cultists, standing, waiting. Their presence is suffocating. Peter's eyes dart around in panic. There's only one way out. Without thinking, he turns and hurls himself out the window. The air rushes past him in a blur. Then, impact. He crashes onto the cold ground below. Everything fades. The ritual is almost complete. A shadow passes over his body. His mother's headless corpse drifts unnaturally through the air, moving with an eerie grace toward the treehouse. A moment later, a strange, glowing orb of light emerges from the darkness and sinks into Peter's back. His body jerks. The final step of the ritual is complete. Every member of his family is gone. And now, he is no longer himself. Slowly, Peter rises to his feet. His movements are sluggish, his expression empty. He turns toward the treehouse. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of burning wax and decay. Dozens of naked cultists kneel in a perfect circle, their heads bowed in reverence before a towering demonic effigy. Atop its grotesque form sits Charlie's rotting head, positioned like a crown. Below it, 2 bodies, his mother's and grandmother's headless corpses, are carefully arranged in ritualistic worship. Peter steps forward, silent. Joan emerges from the shadows, holding a golden crown. With gentle hands, she places it atop his head. Her voice is soft, but filled with absolute devotion. "You are Paimon now. We have freed you from your human prison." The cultists bow lower, whispering fevered praises. Peter, Paimon, stares blankly ahead, his lips slightly parted, a thin line of drool slipping down his chin. The worshippers lift their arms, their voices rising in exultation. "Hail Paimon! Hail Paimon! Hail Paimon!" The ritual is complete. But what would you do if your family was being torn apart by an unseen force, and every attempt to fix things only made it worse? If you discovered terrifying secrets about your own mother, secrets tied to something ancient and evil, would you try to escape, or would you fight to uncover the truth, no matter the cost? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this recap, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Until next time, have a damn good day.